History is often presented to us as a series of inevitable victories, a clean timeline where great men make great discoveries and the world applauds. We are taught to believe that the pillars of modern civilization, medicine, law, engineering, were erected by individuals whose names are etched in marble, men with walls of diplomas and pedigrees as long as the institutions they served. But there are cracks in this polished marble. There are spaces between the lines of the textbooks where the ink seems to fade, where entire lives have been carefully, surgically excised. We are here to read the invisible ink. We are here to uncover the uncomfortable truth that the foundation of modern cardiac surgery was not laid by the celebrated hands of a wealthy surgeon in a spotlight, but by the calloused, overlooked hands of a man whom the system refused to even call a doctor. To understand the magnitude of this erasure, we must first transport ourselves back to the bleak medical landscape of the 1940s. In the corridors of the world's most prestigious hospitals, there existed a terrifying silence in the pediatric wards. It was the silence of resignation. There was a condition known as the tetralogy of Fallot, a congenital heart defect that the public knew simply and heartbreakingly as blue baby syndrome. The name itself was a horror story. These infants were born with a structural flaw in their hearts that prevented blood from reaching their lungs to get oxygen. Imagine holding a newborn child. Instead of the flush of pink that signifies life and vitality, you watch as their skin turns a sickly deep purple, then a terrifying blue. Their lips, their fingertips, their earlobes, all stained the color of a bruise. These children were slowly suffocating from the inside out. They would gasp for air that filled their lungs but never reached their blood. The parents could do nothing but watch. The doctors, the supposed gods of science, could do nothing but offer morphine to ease the passing. It was a death sentence, absolute and cruel. Instead of the flush of pink that signifies life and vitality, you watch as their skin turns a sickly deep purple, then a terrifying blue. Their lips, their fingertips, their earlobes, all stained the color of a bruise. These children were slowly suffocating from the inside out. They would gasp for air that filled their lungs but never reached their blood. The parents could do nothing but watch. The doctors, the supposed gods of science, could do nothing but offer morphine to ease the passing. It was a death sentence, absolute and cruel. Instead of the flush of pink that signifies life and vitality, you watch as their skin turns a sickly deep purple, then a terrifying blue. The medical consensus at the time was not just skeptical of heart surgery, it was hostile toward it. There was a dogma, almost religious in its ferocity, that the human heart was the holy of holies. It was the seat of the soul, the engine of life, and it was untouchable. Decades prior, the great surgeon Theodore Billroth had famously declared that any surgeon who would attempt to suture a wound of the heart deserves to lose the esteem of his colleagues. This curse hung over the medical community like a shroud. To cut into the heart was not just dangerous, it was considered hubris. It was professional suicide. So, the blue babies died. They died in the thousands, while the men in white coats stood by, paralyzed by their own traditions and the limitations of their imagination. But desperation has a way of breaking dogma. As World War II raged across oceans, a different kind of war was being fought in the laboratories of Vanderbilt and later Johns Hopkins. There was a growing pressure to solve the riddle of the heart. The world was waiting for a savior. The narrative of the time, and strictly speaking, the narrative of the era's racism, demanded that this savior look a certain way. He had to be a titan of academia. He had to be a man of high society, educated in the Ivy League, a man whose authority was unquestionable. The medical establishment was a fortress of exclusivity, a club where the price of admission was not just intelligence, but pedigree and skin color. They looked to men like Dr. Alfred Blalock. Blalock was everything the system admired: charismatic, aristocratic, brilliant, and white. He was the golden boy of surgery, a man who walked through the hospital corridors with an entourage of residents hanging on his every word. He was the one the history books were ready to embrace. He was the one the cameras were ready to flash for. And indeed, Blalock was searching for the solution. He was ambitious. He wanted to be the one to break the curse of the Holy of Holies. But there was a secret in Block's lab. There was a variable that the medical journals didn't account for. The hands that were actually doing the work, the mind that was actually solving the three-dimensional puzzle of the failing heart, did not belong to a doctor. They belonged to a man who entered the hospital through the back door, a man who, on the official payroll, was classified as a janitor. The hands that were actually doing the work, the mind that was actually solving the three-dimensional puzzle of the failing heart, did not belong to a doctor. History is often a lie agreed upon, and the lie here was that knowledge flows only from the top down. We are told that the professor teaches the student, that the doctor instructs the technician. But in the basement laboratories of the 1940s, the flow of knowledge was reversed. The world was waiting for a medical messiah to descend from the clouds of academia to save the blue babies. They never suspected that the answer was already there, holding a mop in one hand and a scalpel in the other. The irony is suffocating. The institution that upheld the sanctity of the heart was actively breaking the spirit of the only man who knew how to fix it. They were looking for a hero in the spotlight, completely blind to the genius standing in the shadows. Enter Vivien Thomas. His name should be as recognizable as Einstein or Pasteur, yet for decades it was whispered only by the select few who saw him work, or hidden entirely beneath the signature of another man. Vivien Thomas was not supposed to be a technician. He was a dreamer with a clear path. In 1929, he had the intelligence, the drive, and the savings to attend medical school. He intended to become a doctor. But history is cruel, and timing is everything. The stock market crash of 1929 didn't just break the economy. It evaporated Vivien Thomas's future. His savings were wiped out instantly. The door to medical school slammed shut, locked by poverty and bolted by the systemic racism of the American South. Needing to survive, Thomas took a job at Vanderbilt University. The role? Janitor. But he was assigned to the laboratory of Alfred Blalock. It didn't take long for the dynamic to shift. Blalock, though a product of his prejudiced time, recognized that Thomas possessed a dexterity and an intellect that couldn't be taught. Thomas didn't just clean the cages, he read the textbooks. He didn't just wash the instruments, he studied their design. Slowly, the carpenter turned his hands to the most delicate machinery in existence, the biological engine. Thomas became Blalock's hands. While Blalock had the theories, Thomas had the execution. When they moved to Johns Hopkins, the separation became even more stark. Hopkins was a segregated institution. The cafeteria was for whites only. The restrooms were divided. Thomas walked through a world that told him he was less than human, yet he spent his days performing miracles that no white surgeon could replicate. The problem of the blue baby was a plumbing problem. The pulmonary artery was constricted, preventing blood from getting to the lungs. They needed a bypass, a shunt. They needed to take an artery that went to the arm and splice it into the pulmonary artery to redirect blood flow. It sounds simple now, but in 1944, it was science fiction. The vessels in a baby's heart are the size of matchsticks. The sutures needed to be finer than a human hair. Here is where the genius of the carpenter shone through. The surgical tools required to perform this delicate anastomosis did not exist. You couldn't buy them. So, Vivien Thomas built them. He went to his workbench, using his carpentry skills to grind down needles, to fashion clamps that wouldn't crush the fragile tissue of an infant. He was inventing the technology of cardiac surgery from scrap metal and intuition. He went to his workbench, using his carpentry skills to grind down needles, to fashion clamps that wouldn't crush the fragile tissue of an infant. He performed the procedure on dogs, not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. He perfected the Blalock-Taussig shunt in the animal lab. He encountered every possible complication and solved it. He knew the tension of the vessel wall, the rhythm of the beat, the exact angle of the needle. Dr. Blalock, the famous surgeon, had performed the procedure once or twice on animals with Thomas guiding him. Thomas had done it hundreds of times. He was the expert. Then came the day, November 29, 1944. A baby girl named Eileen Saxon was dying. She was frail, blue, and fading fast. The decision was made to try the experimental surgery on a human. The operating theater at Johns Hopkins was packed. The gallery was filled with the elite of the medical world, watching from above. The lights were hot. The tension was suffocating. Dr. Blalock scrubbed in. He stood over the tiny chest of Eileen Saxon. And then something incredible happened. The confident, aristocratic surgeon froze. He realized that the anatomy of a human infant was terrifiedly different from the dogs he had watched Thomas operate on. The vessels were too small, the margins for error non-existent. Blalock turned and demanded that Vivien Thomas be brought into the operating room. This was a violation of every protocol. A black man, a janitor, standing over the sterile field, it was unheard of. But Blalock knew he couldn't do it alone. Thomas entered, not in scrubs, but in his white lab coat. He wasn't allowed to scrub in. He wasn't allowed to touch the patient. So a stool was brought in. Vivien Thomas stood on a stool behind Dr. Blalock's right shoulder. Imagine the visual. The great white surgeon, the captain of the ship, paralyzed by the complexity of the task and looking over his shoulder to the black Carpenter for instruction. For the next several hours, Thomas guided Blalock's hands. "A little to the left, doctor. Turn the needle now. Watch the tension." The voice of the janitor became the voice of God in that operating room. The great white surgeon, the captain of the ship, paralyzed by the complexity of the task and looking over his shoulder to the black Carpenter for instruction. When the clamps were released, the miracle happened. The baby's lips turned from blue to pink. The room erupted in gasps. They had done the impossible. They had fixed a broken heart. But as the applause began, it was directed at one man, and he was standing on the floor, not the stool. The surgery on Eileen Saxon changed medicine forever. It was the moon landing of cardiac surgery. Almost overnight, Johns Hopkins became the mecca of heart repair. Desperate parents flocked to Baltimore from all over the world, carrying their blue babies, praying for a miracle from the hands of Dr. Alfred Blalock. And Blalock delivered. He became a legend. He graced the covers of magazines, he was feted at galas, he received awards from prestigious medical societies across the globe. The procedure was named the Blalock-Taussig shunt, honoring the surgeon and the cardiologist Helen Taussig, who had the initial idea. But there was a ghost in the machine, a silent partner who dissolved into the background as soon as the flashbulbs popped. Vivien Thomas. The injustice that followed is painful to recount because it wasn't a singular event. It was a slow, grinding exclusion that lasted for decades. At the celebratory parties held to honor the breakthrough, Vivien Thomas was not a guest. In some accounts, he was there, but as a server, pouring drinks for the very men who were toasting a success that belonged to him. While Blalock traveled the world accepting accolades, Thomas returned to the lab. He returned to the colored restrooms. He returned to a paycheck that, despite his world-changing contribution, was still significantly lower than that of the junior residents he was training. And that is perhaps the most stinging irony of all. Vivien Thomas became the teacher of surgeons. As the years went on, the brightest young medical minds in America came to Hopkins to learn the technique. Blalock was often too busy being a celebrity to teach the minutiae of the operation. So he sent them to the lab. He sent them to Vivien. Generations of America's top heart surgeons, men like Denton Cooley, who would go on to perform the first heart transplant in the U.S., learned how to hold a scalpel, how to suture a vein, and how to respect tissue from a man who had never attended a day of medical school. They called him Vivien, not Dr. Thomas, not Mr. Thomas, just Vivien. The hierarchy was rigid, maintained by the unspoken rules of a society that could not admit a black man was the superior intellect in the room. For 30 years, Thomas worked in the shadows. He developed new procedures. He ran the surgical research laboratory. He was the old hands that the residents feared and respected. Yet, if you looked at the official hospital directory, he was invisible. A tool. A resource, not a colleague. He was the old hands that the residents feared and respected. Yet, if you looked at the official hospital directory, he was invisible. It wasn't until Dr. Blalock died that the fog began to lift, and, even then, it was slow. It took the changing of an era, the civil rights movement, and the insistence of the very surgeons Thomas had trained for the institution to acknowledge its sin. In 1976, 3 decades after the first blue baby surgery, Johns Hopkins finally awarded Vivien Thomas an honorary doctorate. The ceremony was emotional. The man who had walked through the back door was finally standing at the podium. But the most powerful image came later. Today, if you walk the halls of Johns Hopkins, you will see the portraits of the great surgeons lining the walls. There is Alfred Blalock, looking regal. And there, hanging right next to him, is Vivien Thomas. It is a portrait of vindication, but it is also a portrait of a tragedy, because no honorary degree can give him back the years of disrespect. No portrait can undo the fact that he struggled financially while his invention generated millions. We tell his story today not just to honor a scientific genius, but to remind ourselves of the cost of prejudice. How many other Vivien Thomases have we lost? How many cures, how many symphonies, how many inventions have been strangled in the cradle of racism and inequality? Vivien Thomas was the carpenter who taught doctors how to save hearts. He proved that genius has no race and that true skill cannot be defined by a diploma. He was the invisible hands that stitched a future for thousands of children. And finally, definitively, we are writing his name in permanent ink. And finally, definitively, we are writing his name in permanent ink.